Most people at a funeral are there because they lost someone. The 10 people in this video were there for a different reason. They needed to watch. They needed to be seen grieving. They needed to make sure nobody was looking at them too closely while investigators started asking questions about who might have done this. One man cried at the graveside of a woman he had strangled in her sleep the night before, while his 2 young sons lay in their beds in the same house. Another sat in a pew at his classmate's service and repeated a false alibi to police. 6 days before that alibi fell apart, and he led detectives to a canyon where he had buried the knives. A pastor shook hands with the family of 3 people he had shot dead inside a pawn shop, posted condolences on Facebook, and attended the funeral 9 days after pulling the trigger. A man shook a dead woman's son's hand at the church door. He had killed her at a bus stop that morning, while she listened to gospel music on her headphones. These are not people who panicked and ran. They all made the same deliberate choice: stay close, perform the grief, and let the world assume the worst had already passed. Every single one of them was wrong about that. Case 1. Henry Louis Wallace. __quote_0__ Henry Louis Wallace was born on November 4th, 1965, in Barnwell, South Carolina. Growing up, he was the kind of person people genuinely liked. He made the student council at Barnwell High School. He was the only male cheerleader on the squad. He got good grades and was well liked by nearly everyone who knew him. After graduating in 1983, he worked as a disc jockey at a local radio station, went to several colleges, and joined the United States Navy in 1985. He married his high school girlfriend, Moretta Brabham, in 1987. To anyone looking from the outside, his life was moving forward the way most people hope theirs will. Nobody saw what was coming. In November 1991, Wallace moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, and found work at fast food restaurants. He eventually became a manager at a Taco Bell location in East Charlotte. He was good at the job. He knew everybody. He laughed with co-workers, looked out for his staff, and made people feel like he genuinely cared about them. Women who worked with him described him as the big brother type, someone they felt safe around. That trust was the most dangerous thing about him. By the time investigators in Charlotte finally connected a string of murders to one man, 11 women were already dead. Every single one of them had known Henry Louis Wallace personally. Every one of them had let him through their front door, and after killing some of them, he stood at their funerals. Caroline Love was 20 years old. She worked at a Bojangles restaurant on Central Avenue and was known by co-workers as a standout employee. She was quiet, hard-working, and completely unpretentious. She was also the roommate of Wallace's girlfriend at the time, which meant he had easy access to her apartment and her trust. On June 14, 1992, Wallace went to her home and strangled her. He left her body in a wooded area outside Charlotte. Then he walked to the police station with members of her family and helped file a missing persons report. He joined the search. He stood beside the people looking for a woman he had already killed. Her body was not found for nearly 2 years, not until after Wallace was arrested and led investigators to her. Shauna Hawk was 20 years old and studying at Central Piedmont Community College. She wanted to become a paralegal. She wanted to have a child one day. People who knew her described her as warm, kind, and generous. She had worked at Taco Bell, where Wallace was her direct supervisor. On the afternoon of February 19, 1993, Wallace went to Shauna's home. He strangled her and left her body submerged in the bathtub. Then he went to her funeral. Shauna's mother, Dee Sumter, was standing at that funeral. She did not know that the familiar face from Taco Bell, the man who had been her daughter's boss, was the reason she was there. After the service, Wallace approached Sumter directly. He told her how much he missed Shauna. He said he was sorry for her loss. Sumter thanked him. Years later, when she found out the truth, she described what he did as the act of a bold demon. Those were her exact words. He had the literal gall, she said, to show up at a service for someone he knew he personally killed. On June 22, 1993, Wallace killed 24-year-old Audrey Spain, a Taco Bell co-worker her parents called Baby. She had come to Charlotte from a small town in South Carolina, hoping to build a career working with computers. Her body was found on June 25th. On August 10, 1993, Wallace killed 21-year-old Valencia Jumper, a computer science major at Johnson C. Smith University, who was also a close friend of his sister. After killing her, he set her apartment on fire to make it appear she had died in an accidental blaze. The medical examiner initially ruled her death as carbon monoxide poisoning. A few days after her funeral, Wallace was there too. He went with his sister. He sent Valencia's family condolences. He stood among the people grieving for a woman he had strangled and then set on fire to hide what he had done. He attended Vanessa Mack's funeral as well. Vanessa was 25 years old, killed on February 20th, 1994. Wallace knew her through her sister, who had worked with him at Taco Bell. After her body was found, he was spotted crying near the scene. Verified records and multiple sources confirm Wallace attended the funerals of Shauna Hawke, Valencia Jumper, and Vanessa Mack. At Shauna Hawke's service, he was documented as having approached and spoken directly to the victim's mother. On September 14, 1993, he killed 20-year-old Michelle Stinson, a single mother and college student, in front of her oldest son. In March 1994, within the span of just a few days, he killed Betty Jean Borkham, 24, Brandy Henderson, 18, and Deborah Slaughter, 35. Brandy Henderson was 18 years old and had a 10-month-old son named Tyrese. Wallace also attacked the baby during the same incident. Tyrese was found in time and survived after being rushed to hospital. 11 women in total. All of them knew him. All of them trusted him. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department homicide unit in the early 1990s had between 6 and 8 detectives managing all homicides, suicides, accidents, and missing persons cases across the entire city. Charlotte recorded 129 murders in 1993 alone, its deadliest year on record, driven heavily by a crack epidemic that had overwhelmed the entire region. Former Detective Gary McFadden, who worked the case and later became Mecklenburg County Sheriff, described the conditions plainly. The unit never had time to collaborate. They never had time to give individual cases the attention they deserved. They were working under conditions that made it nearly impossible to spot patterns. Wallace also took steps to protect himself. He wiped down surfaces at each scene after killing his victims. He burned evidence. After one killing, he had the victim shower beforehand. The fire he set at Valencia Jumper's apartment worked so well that investigators initially listed her cause of death as accidental. Without obvious physical evidence tying him to any of the scenes, and with an understaffed unit stretched far beyond capacity, the killings continued. There was also something else underneath all of it. Every victim was a young black woman. Most were working class. Several were struggling financially. Dee Sumter, Shauna Hawke's mother, spoke about this publicly and without hesitation for decades after her daughter's death. The victims were not prominent people with social or economic status, she said. They were not special to the people who were supposed to protect them. And she believed that shaped how seriously the cases were handled. Deborah Slaughter's father made the same point in his own words. The girls just were not important to the police, he said. They did not live in a high-rent district. They worked in fast food restaurants. And nobody treated their disappearances like emergencies. The turning point came in the first week of March 1994, when 3 women were killed within days of each other, including 2 from the same apartment complex, killed on back-to-back days. That concentration of violence finally pushed investigators to look at all the cases side by side. When detectives started asking each victim's family and friends to name every person who had access to their homes and their lives, the same name kept appearing on every single list: Henry Louis Wallace. A surveillance camera at a bank had already captured an image of someone trying to use one of the victim's bank cards after her death. The image did not show a clear face, but it showed a distinctive gold cross-shaped earring. When investigators pulled Wallace's file and found an old mugshot showing that same earring, the case shifted. Then, when they examined the car of Betty Jean Borkham, found abandoned after her death, they lifted a palm print from the outside of the vehicle. Wallace had prior criminal history, which meant his prints were already in the system. The palm print matched. Wallace was arrested on March 12, 1994, the same day the body of his final victim was discovered. During questioning at the police station that night, he confessed. He wrote down the names of his victims. He admitted to 11 murders across 2 states. He led investigators to the wooded area where Caroline Love's body had been hidden for nearly 2 years. When Dee Sumter heard about the arrest and saw his face on the television news, she collapsed to the floor with such force that she hit her head and started bleeding. His trial began in September 1996 at Mecklenburg County Superior Court and lasted nearly 4 months. Prosecutor Ann Tompkins led the case for the state. Wallace's defense team, led by public defender Isabel Scott Day, argued that his confession had been coerced and that he suffered from mental illness and drug addiction. Wallace had indeed become addicted to crack cocaine, a fact he admitted to investigators himself. But the jury was not persuaded. On January 7, 1997, they found him guilty of 9 counts of first-degree murder. On January 29, 1997, he was handed 9 death sentences, one for each of the 9 victims he had been tried for. The 2 remaining victims, Tashanda Bethia and Sharon Nance, were not included in the trial charges. Before leaving the courtroom after sentencing, Wallace read a handwritten statement to the families of the women he had killed. None of these women deserved what they got, he said. They did nothing to him that warranted their deaths. He asked for forgiveness. The families in that courtroom had already waited years for that moment. Some of them had stood beside him at funerals without knowing the truth. Some of them had thanked him for coming. Henry Lewis Wallace is currently housed at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, awaiting execution. He has filed multiple appeals over the years, claiming his confession was coerced and that his constitutional rights were violated. Every appeal has been denied. As of today, he remains on death row, more than 3 decades after his arrest. The women he killed were between 18 and 35 years old. They were students, mothers, daughters, and co-workers. Dee Sumter, who found her daughter dead in the bathtub and then watched her killer grieve at her funeral, went on to co-found an organisation called Mothers of Murdered Offspring, which still operates today in Charlotte, supporting families of homicide victims. She has said publicly that even now, decades later, the mere mention of her daughter's name can reduce her to tears in an instant. What happened in Charlotte between 1992 and 1994 was not just a series of murders, it was a man walking freely through an entire community, being welcomed into homes, trusted with jobs and friendships, and standing at grave sites watching families bury the people he had taken from them. Gary McFadden, the detective who helped bring him down, later described Wallace as the perfect human predator. He walked into their lives, McFadden said, knowing that at some point he was going to take them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Wallace used the trust of his personal relationships to move invisibly through his crimes, the next killer on this list used something even more intimate to stay hidden. He did not just know his victim, he was supposed to be family. Case 2, Adam Williamson, Victoria, Australia, 2015. Kenneth Handford had lived a long life by almost any measure. He was born in 1925 and grew up in a world very different from the one he would leave behind. As a young man, he joined the Royal Australian Air Force and served his country during World War II. After the war ended, he came home, built a life, raised a family, and eventually settled in the small rural community of Springbank, Victoria, in 1996. He worked as a farmhand on a potato farm on Bungaree Barkstead Road, long after most men his age had stopped working entirely. He had 5 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. People who knew him described him as a man without an enemy in the world. His daughter told a court later that her father had once said to her that he was not afraid of dying. What scared him, he said, was how he was going to die. He never got the peaceful end he deserved. On the night of September 14, 2015, 2 men kicked open the back door of Ken Handford's home. He was 89 years old and he was alone. One of those men was Adam Lucas Williamson, 40 years old. The other was Jonathan Jeffrey Cooper, 29. They had been overheard by neighbours planning the break-in the day before. They believed Ken kept large amounts of cash hidden in his bedroom, possibly as much as $20,000, because he was known to avoid banks and preferred to deal in cash. That belief turned out to be partially correct. When they left that night, they took $3,900 in cash, a gold chain, a mobile phone, and nearly a dozen of Ken's war medals from his military service. Williamson was the one who planned it. He had worked alongside Ken Hanford at that same Springbank potato farm for several years. He knew the property. He knew the old man's habits. He knew there was cash in the house. Court documents later revealed he was also believed to have been taking money from Ken during the time they worked together. He had a grudge, and he had a plan, and he recruited Cooper to help him carry it out. What happened inside that house in the early hours of September 14th was something that shocked even seasoned investigators. Cooper was carrying a double-bladed knife. When Ken woke up during the break-in, Cooper struck him in the head with a torch. When Ken reached for a phone to call for help, Cooper hit his hand with the same torch to stop him. Then Williamson told his partner something that was a complete and deliberate lie. Knowing that Cooper had suffered harm at the hands of a trusted authority figure as a child, and knowing exactly how that would affect him, Williamson told Cooper that Ken Hanford was a predator who had done the same to others. It was a calculated manipulation. It was entirely false. Ken Hanford had never harmed anyone. Cooper, already under the influence of methamphetamine, and now consumed by manufactured rage at a lie his partner had fed him, stabbed Ken Hanford 13 times in the back. The two men then bound his hands with the cord from his own dressing gown and tied his legs to the bed. They left him on the floor. They walked out with his medals and his money and his gold chain and drove away into the night. Ken Hanford lay there for 4 hours and 38 minutes. His pacemaker recorded the entire time. He was still alive when they left. He died alone on his floor in the early hours of the morning. His body was found the next day by neighbours. That day, September 15th, 2015, would have been his 90th birthday. Williamson did not run. He did not go into hiding. He attended Ken Hanford's funeral. He stood among the mourners. He approached Ken's granddaughter, Leah Hanford, directly. He spoke to her. He offered his condolences. Leah had no reason to suspect him at that moment. He was a familiar face. He had worked with her grandfather for years. Her family knew him. Her own cousin had known Williamson for more than a decade. There was nothing at the funeral that day to suggest the man offering his sympathies to the grieving family was the same man who had planned the attack that killed him. Cooper, by contrast, panicked after the killing and went into hiding. Investigators began their work immediately after Ken's body was found. A media release was issued asking the public for help. That release, it turned out, would be part of what brought Williamson down. After the release went out, Cooper, Williamson, and a mutual associate met up. During that meeting, Williamson received a phone call. He failed to hang up properly. Police, who were already monitoring calls connected to the investigation, were on the line. They overheard the three men talking about the media release and about the car that had been used on the night of the killing. Cooper had also already told a friend about what happened. He had shown that friend his bloody knife and clothes. He had told that friend that during the attack, Ken Hanford had recognised Williamson and cried out his name. According to Cooper's account as relayed in court, the old man had said Williamson's name out loud while being attacked. He knew who had come for him. 6 weeks after Ken Hanford was killed, both men were arrested. Cooper pleaded guilty early in the process. He admitted to being the one who inflicted the stab wounds. He was sentenced in April 2017 to 16 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 13 years. That sentence deeply upset Ken's family. His granddaughters Leah Hanford and Courtney Pierce launched a public petition calling for a more severe sentence. That petition gathered 30,000 signatures and was formally presented to the Victorian Attorney General. The family felt that the sentence did not come close to reflecting what had been done to their grandfather. Williamson's path through the courts was longer and more complicated. He initially pleaded guilty to the murder, but then changed his mind and withdrew that plea in December 2016. The judge presiding over the case, Justice Jane Dixon of the Victorian Supreme Court, made it clear when he re-entered his guilty plea that he could not change his mind again. He was bound by it. The prosecution, led by Justin Lewis, told the court that Williamson was the driving force behind everything that happened on September 14th. He had organised the burglary. He had recruited Cooper. He had known about the knife Cooper was carrying when they set out. He had fed Cooper a deliberate lie to provoke him into violence, And he had done all of this because he wanted money and because he had a personal grievance against an 89-year-old man who had never wronged him. In April 2018, Justice Jane Dixon sentenced Adam Williamson to 27 years in prison. He must serve 23 years before he is eligible for parole. The judge described his conduct in sentencing as brutal and cowardly. She noted that while Cooper had physically inflicted the wounds, Williamson bore criminal responsibility for the killing because he had organized, enabled, and manipulated his way to that outcome. His sentence was 3 years longer than Cooper's, reflecting the court's view that Williamson was the instigator and the more culpable of the two. Williamson appealed the severity of his sentence. In June 2019, the Court of Appeal at the Victorian Supreme Court in Melbourne rejected that appeal entirely. One of the appeal judges noted that Justice Dixon had been justified in her approach, given the full circumstances of the case, including that Williamson was 10 years older than Cooper, that his personal circumstances offered no mitigating factors, and that he had been the organising mind behind the killing. Leah Handford, speaking to the Courier after the appeal was dismissed, said the family was relieved. She said the court's findings reflected what the family had believed all along, that Williamson was ultimately responsible. She had been the granddaughter standing at the funeral while he offered her his condolences. She was the one who had thanked him. Years later, describing the impact of her grandfather's death, she said it was incomprehensible that someone could do that to a 90-year-old man who had served his country, worked his whole life, and supported his family. A man who was entitled to see out his years in peace. Ken Hamford's war medals were stolen on the night he was killed. Some were later recovered by police and returned to his family. He had earned those medals as a young man flying missions for his country, at a time when the world was at war. He had kept them for decades. They were among the last things taken from him. The family has continued to speak publicly about Ken in the years since his death. In 2025, on the 10-year anniversary of the killing, Leah Handford gave an interview reflecting on what had been lost. She said her grandfather is still cherished by everyone who knew him. She said the legal case following his murder has been cited in more than 100 subsequent court decisions in Victoria, a legacy that came from the worst thing that ever happened to her family. What made this case stand out beyond the killing itself was the calculated nature of what Williamson did at that funeral. He did not stumble in by accident. He knew the family. He had worked with Ken for years. He walked up to a grieving granddaughter who had no reason to distrust him and offered her comfort while carrying the full knowledge of what he had done. It was not grief. It was performance. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes a very different turn. Where Williamson planned everything methodically over days, the man at the centre of the next story had no plan at all when he walked through those funeral doors. What he did there was entirely impulsive, and it ended the moment he sat down beside the wrong person. Case 3. Duna Greer, Atlanta, Georgia, 2015. Tiffany Louise Bailey was 24 years old. She lived in an apartment at Pavilion Place on Cleveland Avenue in southwest Atlanta, Georgia. She had 3 young children. She was known to the people around her as a mother first and foremost, a woman who was raising her kids in a neighborhood that had seen more than its share of tragedy. She was not famous. She was not wealthy. She was just a young woman trying to build a life. And on the evening of November 7th, 2015, she was shot in the head inside her own apartment while her children were present. Her boyfriend, Duna Greer, was 26 years old. He was in that apartment when it happened. He was the one who called for help, and when police arrived, he was the one who told them the story. According to Greer, they had been the victims of a home invasion. He told officers that he sold marijuana and that someone had come to rob them. He said Bailey had been caught in the middle of it. It was a plausible enough story on the surface, the kind that investigators hear regularly in neighbourhoods where illegal street-level dealing is common. Greer knew that. He built his account around it deliberately. Police took note of what he said, processed the scene, and took Bailey to the hospital. She died 2 days later, on November 9th, 2015. The gunshot wound to her left eye was not survivable. She never regained consciousness. What Greer did not account for was his own conscience, and he did not account for his children. In the days following Bailey's death, investigators began quietly gathering information. A friend of Greer's told police that Greer had confessed to the killing privately, not to authorities but to someone he trusted. That information was passed to detectives. Then came something no investigator could have anticipated or engineered on their own. Bailey's daughter, who was 6 years old at the time, spoke to police. She was young enough that she had no reason to understand the implications of what she was saying. She told officers what she had seen that night inside the apartment. She said that her mother and her father had been fighting. She said that during that fight, he had grabbed his gun and shot her mother. A 6-year-old child had just given investigators the account they needed. Her words were plain. There was no confusion in them. She described exactly what she witnessed. Despite this, no arrest had been made by November 17th, 10 days after the shooting. Investigators were still building the case, corroborating the accounts they had received, and working through the process. That morning, Tiffany Bailey's funeral was held at the Workhouse of Faith Missionary Baptist Church on Pryor Street Southwest in Atlanta. Family, friends, and members of the community came to pay their respects. Among them was Greer. He came to the church where the woman he had killed was being laid to rest. He sat among her family. He listened to the preacher. He was present for the service. And then, somewhere in the middle of it all, something shifted. Greer did not make it through the entire funeral. Midway through the service, he approached an officer. The officer was attending the funeral off-duty, not there in any official capacity, just present as someone connected to the community. Greer told him that he wanted to turn himself in. He said he wanted to go to the homicide unit and take responsibility for what had happened to Tiffany Bailey. The off-duty officer stepped outside and flagged down a passing patrol car. At around 11:50 in the morning, that officer was asked to escort Greer from the church to the police department so that he could surrender to the homicide unit. Greer left the funeral in the back of a police car. He had walked in as a mourner and left in custody. What happened outside the church in the minutes after his departure added a layer of violence to an already devastating day. 2 cars drove past the Workhouse of Faith Missionary Baptist Church and fired multiple gunshots. Police detained one suspect quickly. A witness told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that a group of men had gotten into a confrontation with people they believed were connected to Bailey's death, then driven off and circled back to fire the shots. No one was injured in the shooting. Whether that incident was directly connected to Greer's arrest or to broader tensions surrounding Bailey's death was never confirmed by authorities. At the police department, Greer formally confessed. He admitted that he had shot Tiffany Bailey. He was charged with murder and aggravated assault and held in Fulton County Jail without bond. Atlanta police spokeswoman Kim Jones confirmed the charges the following day. The confirmation from the Fulton County District Attorney's Office that followed laid out what investigators had gathered. Greer's role had been confirmed by multiple sources, the release stated. A friend had told police about his private confession, and Bailey's 6-year-old daughter had told investigators what she witnessed that night. The DA's office release quoted her account directly. "Mummy and Daddy were fighting when Daddy grabbed his gun and shot Mummy." Those were the words of a child describing the last moments of her mother's life. Greer went to trial in 2016 in Fulton County Superior Court. The case was not complicated by the time it reached the courtroom. He had confessed twice, once to a friend and once to police. A child witness had described the event. The home invasion story he had told officers on the night of the shooting had fallen apart completely. The jury convicted him of malice murder, possession of a weapon during the commission of a crime, and cruelty to children. The cruelty to children charge reflected the fact that Bailey's 3 young children had been present in that apartment when she was killed. Fulton County Superior Court Judge Ural Glanville sentenced Greer to life in prison, plus an additional 15 years. Greer appealed his convictions to the Georgia Supreme Court. He challenged the verdict on 3 grounds: that the evidence was insufficient to support the convictions, that the trial court had made an error in allowing statements made by Bailey's young daughters to be admitted, and that his legal representation had been ineffective. The Georgia Supreme Court reviewed the case and in 2022 affirmed his convictions across the board. Every argument he raised was rejected. He remains in prison. Tiffany Bailey's 3 children lost their mother on November 9, 2015. The youngest was a toddler. The oldest was 6 years old and had watched it happen. What those children carried forward from that night is not something any court record can fully capture. The apartment complex where they lived Pavilion Place on Cleveland Avenue, had already seen violence before that night. It would see more in the years that followed. Tiffany Bailey was one of at least 2 people killed there in that period. Her name was cited in multiple subsequent news reports covering the complex, almost always as a passing reference to the 24-year-old mother who was shot by her boyfriend, which is a thin sentence to describe a person's entire life. What made Greer's case unusual among the cases in this video was not a calculated plan. He did not attend that funeral to maintain a cover story or to position himself among grieving family members for strategic reasons. Something inside him gave way before the service was even finished. Whether that was genuine guilt, fear of being caught, or something else entirely, only he would know. What is verifiable is what he did. He sat in a church full of people mourning the woman he had killed, and then he stood up, found a police officer, and ended it himself. Every other killer in this video controlled the moment of their exposure, either through investigation or circumstance. Greer handed himself over. But the outcome for Tiffany Bailey was the same regardless. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next man on this list had no such moment of conscience. He did not confess. He did not surrender. He stood at a funeral, shook hands with a grieving family, gave a television interview, and went home. And he nearly got away with it entirely. Case 4. Jeffrey W. Skullin, Jr., Strongsville, Ohio. Melinda Pleskovic had been a teacher for more than 2 decades. She taught 6th grade at Strongsville Middle School in the suburbs southwest of Cleveland, Ohio, and by every account she was exactly the kind of teacher that students and parents remember long after the school year ends. She had spent 27 years in the Strongsville City Schools District. She was described by the school district's superintendent as beloved. She was a mother of 3 children and a grandmother. She coached. She was known in her community as someone who gave generously of her time and herself. And the people who spoke about her after her death used the same words over and over. Loving, caring, compassionate. Her husband was Bruce Pleskovic. Their children included 2 daughters and a teenage son with a disability that affected his ability to communicate. When their daughter Anna became pregnant, Bruce and Melinda did what many parents do. They opened their home. They let Anna's boyfriend move in so the young family could stay together under one roof and get the support they needed. It was a decision made from love and generosity. The young man they let into their home was Jeffrey William Skullin, Jr. He was 20 years old. His father was a retired Cleveland police officer. He was engaged to Anna. He had a 1-year-old daughter with her. He was supposed to be marrying into the family. Instead, he would become the person who destroyed it. What the Pleskovics did not know when they welcomed Skullin into their home was that he had been stealing from them. According to prosecutors, money began disappearing not long after he moved in. Bruce Pleskovic later told the court that the family took Skullin in and that within a short time, the financial losses started. Skullin was not contributing, he was taking. The situation escalated in the weeks before October 2017. Skullin and Anna had a wedding date set for October 28th. The venue was booked, the plans were made. But behind the scenes, the wedding was falling apart in a way that the Pleskovic family did not yet know about. Prosecutors later revealed that Skullin's credit card had been declined by the wedding venue 14 times. 14 separate attempts, all rejected. The venue eventually cancelled the booking entirely and contacted Melinda Pleskovic directly about the failed payments. Melinda found out what had been happening with the money. She was planning to confront Skullin that weekend. Skullin knew it was coming. Prosecutors later stated in court that Skullin had been planning the killing ahead of time. In the weeks before October 23rd, a series of incidents occurred at the Blazing Star Drive home that investigators would later conclude were staged. Car alarms would go off in the night. There were reports of suspicious people near the property. On 2 separate occasions, Skullin called police to report attempted break-ins at the house. In August, he reported 1 incident. On October 19th, just 4 days before the murder, he called 911 again to report someone trying to enter the home. He gave a detailed description of the alleged intruder. He described a figure in a blue hoodie. According to investigators and prosecutors, both incidents were fabricated by Skullin. He set off the alarms himself. He called in break-ins that never happened. He was building a false pattern, a paper trail designed to make the family and police believe they were being targeted by an unknown criminal from outside. Bruce Pleskovic told the 911 dispatcher on the night his wife's body was found that there had been a number of suspected break-ins at the property in recent weeks, which was precisely the impression Skullin had worked to create. On the evening of October 23, 2017, Melinda Pleskovic was supposed to join her family for dinner. She never arrived. While she was at home on Blazing Star Drive, Skullin went back to the house. He brought a tactical knife. What happened inside that kitchen that evening was documented in later court proceedings. Melinda Pleskovic was found to have died from more than 30 stab wounds and 3 gunshot wounds. She was 49 years old. After killing her, Skullin left the house. He went to the Applebee's restaurant where Anna was working that night. He had dinner with Bruce Pleskovic. The two of them sat together, ate a meal, and then drove home together. When they walked through the door and found Melinda on the kitchen floor, both men called 911. Bruce Pleskovic's call to the dispatcher was that of a husband who had just walked in on a nightmare. He said he had just come in the door with his new son-in-law. He told the operator he thought someone had killed his wife. He said it looked like she had stab wounds on her back. Skullin's call was different in a way that would matter later. When the dispatcher asked if he knew who had attacked her, Skullin said no. He said they had just come home. He told the dispatcher that he had taken his daughter and the Pleskovics' son outside when he realised what had happened inside. He referred to the person who hurt Melinda as an attacker, framing the scene as though an intruder had been responsible, which was precisely the narrative the fake break-in reports had been designed to support. Melinda Pleskovic's funeral was held at St. Paul Lutheran Church on Bagley Road in Strongsville. Jeffrey Skullin Jr. stood at the front of that church and carried her coffin. He was one of the pallbearers. He walked out of the church with the casket of the woman he had killed, in front of her family, her colleagues, her former students, and her friends. Melinda was then buried at Strongsville Cemetery on Pearl Road. That funeral took place on October 28, 2017. The same day. The same church. That had been the wedding date. That had been the wedding venue. October 28th at St. Paul Lutheran Church was the day Jeffrey Skullin was supposed to marry Anna Pleskovic. Instead, he stood there as a pallbearer at her mother's funeral. 3 days later, on October 31st, he was arrested. The case against him came together through physical evidence and a confession. Investigators found a large tactical knife on the back seat of a truck Skullin acknowledged driving on the day of the killing. The knife had Melinda Pleskovic's blood on the blade. Skullin's DNA was on the handle. That knife was linked to the stab wounds. Detectives then found a backpack in Skullin's Buick sedan. Inside the backpack was a revolver. Ballistics testing confirmed it was the same weapon that had fired the bullets recovered from Melinda's body. Also in the bag were a pair of sweatpants belonging to Skullin that were covered in Melinda's blood. Security camera footage and cell phone data placed him at the scene. When detectives confronted him with all of this during interrogation, he eventually confessed. He told investigators where the weapons could be found and consented to the searches that recovered them. In the recorded interrogation footage, Skullin told Detective Ronald Stolz that everything after the first shot felt like a dream. He said he did not remember the stabbing. His defense team spent months attempting to suppress the confession, arguing it had been coerced. A suppression hearing was held in October 2018 before Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court Judge Pamela Barker. 6 witnesses testified, including DNA specialists, Strongsville police officers, detectives, and an FBI special agent. Judge Barker reviewed all of the interrogation footage and denied the motion to suppress. The confession would stand. On October 17, 2018, the day his murder trial was scheduled to begin and jury selection was set to start, Skullin changed his not guilty plea to no contest. Under Ohio law, a no contest plea is not a formal admission of guilt, but the judge finds the defendant guilty based on the evidence presented and sentences accordingly. His attorney told reporters that Skullin maintained his innocence and was entering the plea for the sake of the family, to spare them from having to sit through a prolonged trial. The attorney also noted that there was sensitive material that might come out during proceedings, and that Skullin had a young child with the victim's family, and did not want to inflict more pain. Judge Barker found him guilty on all 7 counts: aggravated murder, murder, felonious assault, tampering with evidence, making false alarms, and endangering children. The endangering children charge reflected the fact that his 1-year-old daughter had been inside the home while the killing was taking place. The making false alarms charge directly addressed the fabricated break-in reports. At the sentencing hearing on October 29, 2018, 3 members of the Pleskovich family addressed the court. Bruce Pleskovich told the judge that his family had taken Skullin in as their own. They had given him a home, support, and a place to build his life. He said the loss of Melinda would have a rippling effect on their children, and on him for the rest of his life. His daughters were heartbroken, he said, over a mother who could never be replaced. Anna Pleskovich, who had been engaged to Skullin and had a child with him, stood in that courtroom and looked directly at the father of her daughter. She called him an egotistical boy. She said a man does not harm his loved ones. A man owns his actions and does not hide behind lies. A man supports his family and does anything for his children. Jeff has done none of these things, she said. She said he should never breathe another breath of free air. Her sister Megan told the court that their mother had been the face of compassion, love, and perseverance, and that because of Jeffrey Skullin, she was gone. Their lives would never be the same. Skullin was given the opportunity to speak. He said nothing. Judge Barker sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 33 years. That sentence was made up of a life term on the aggravated murder conviction, served consecutively with a 3-year firearm specification. He received credit for the 363 days he had already served in custody. He will not be eligible for parole consideration until he is in his mid-50s at the earliest. Skullin appealed. The Ohio Court of Appeals reviewed the case and in 2019 upheld the conviction in full. Every argument raised on appeal was rejected. He remains incarcerated. Melinda Pleskovich's school district honoured her memory after her death. The community fundraised in her name. Her superintendent described her as beloved. The family that Bruce and Melinda had built together, the same family that opened its doors to a young man who needed somewhere to live, was the family that Skullin systematically deceived, drained, and ultimately destroyed. He staged break-ins for weeks. He sat down to dinner with Bruce Pleskovich the same evening he killed Melinda. He carried her coffin out of the church. He said nothing at sentencing. He has never, according to the people who knew and loved Melinda, offered any explanation for why he did it, or any apology to the people he left behind. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Bruce Pleskovich confirmed this directly to the court. Skullin never told them why. He never said he was sorry. Case 5. Kenneth Aake, Burnside, Kentucky, 2013. Michael and Angela Hockensmith were both Kentucky natives who had built their lives around 2 things: their faith and their family. They had married in December 2000 and had 2 children together, a son named Andrew and a daughter named Naomi. Michael was a graduate of Clear Creek Baptist Bible College, and at the time of his death was serving as the youth minister at Mitchellsburg Baptist Church in Danville, Kentucky. Angela was a homeschool mother who was actively involved in her husband's ministry and was known for her involvement in singing ministry at the church. The 2 of them had moved to Danville in 2013, after nearly a decade of marriage, putting down roots in the community and building the kind of life that centered entirely around their children and their church. They had also recently taken on a new business venture. They became co-owners of ABC Gold Games and More, a pawn shop in Danville. Their son Andrew later described the shop as basically his home growing up. It was a playground to him. He absolutely loved it. Both children spent time there regularly, and on the morning of September 20th, 2013, they were both inside the shop when everything changed. The man who walked through the door that morning was someone who knew all 3 adults in the building personally. He had done business with Michael and Angela for years, and days after killing them, he would stand at their funeral and express his condolences to the people they had left behind. Kenneth Allen Keith was 48 years old in September 2013. He was the pastor of Main Street Baptist Church in Burnside, Kentucky, a small town roughly 50 miles south of Danville. He also owned and operated his own gold-buying shop, Gold Rush Gold Buyers, in Somerset. Keith had a history with the ABC pawn shop that went back further than most people in Danville knew. He had previously owned that same shop before selling it. Michael Hockensmith had actually worked for Keith as the store manager for roughly 2 years before the ownership changed. When Michael and Angela became co-owners with another man named Steve Devine, Keith was effectively pushed out of a business he had previously controlled. Then the arrangement between Devine and the Hockensmiths cut Keith out of a gold bullion deal he had expected to be part of. Gold broker Daniel Smith, 60 years old, was being brought in to handle transactions that Keith had anticipated being involved with himself. Keith had been losing money. He believed the Hockensmiths had taken his business from him. That belief had been building for months. According to investigators, Keith had purchased his weapon as far back as January 2013 and had been researching Daniel Smith online since February 2013. The planning had been underway for the better part of a year before he acted on it. On the morning of September 20th, 2013, Keith drove from Burnside to Danville. He wore a disguise including what appeared to be a fake beard, which Andrew later described as having white tips near the ears that made it look artificial. Keith entered the ABC pawn shop after the business had opened. He locked the front door behind him after entering, breaking off part of a key in the lock in his haste. Then he told everyone to get down and demanded money. What happened next was witnessed by an 8-year-old boy. Andrew Hockensmith was in the shop with his parents and baby sister Naomi. Keith produced a firearm. He shot Daniel Smith first. He shot Michael Hockensmith next. Angela Hockensmith pulled Andrew close and retreated to the corner with him and baby Naomi. Lead detective Kevin Peel later recounted that Angela could be heard pleading with the shooter not to harm her children, which investigators believed was the reason the children were not also shot. Before the final shot was fired, Angela told Andrew to take his sister to the back room. The boy did exactly what his mother told him. He carried his toddler sister to the back of the store, sat her on a couch, and waited. Andrew later told investigators he could hear sounds like a dart gun, then silence. He went back out and found his parents on the floor. He called 911 at 9:17 in the morning. He was 8 years old. He told the dispatcher that a robber had shot his parents and that he did not know if the person was still in the building. He asked them to come quickly because he was afraid. He told them his parents were dead on the ground. Investigators who later reviewed the recording noted that baby Naomi could be heard cooing in the background of that call. The dispatcher stayed on the line with Andrew for 6 full minutes until officers arrived and forced entry into the locked building. When police entered, gold broker Daniel Smith was the first body they encountered, lying on the floor near the entrance with a visible pattern of blood indicating he had been moved after being shot. Michael Hockensmith was found behind the counter. Angela Hockensmith was in the back of the store. Lead detective Peel recalled that as he moved through the room, he nearly stepped over Angela's body before he saw her, and that the infant Naomi was seated on the floor beside her deceased mother. He said he had not heard the child crying until that moment, even though she had apparently been crying the whole time. Keith fled the scene in a silver or grey minivan. Before leaving, he took items from the store, including Daniel Smith's receipt briefcase, which would later become a critical piece of evidence. Keith had constructed what he believed was an alibi. He had told people he left Burnside early that morning, went to his own shop, then drove to the VA hospital in Lexington for an appointment, and then stopped at a pharmacy in Danville to pick up medication for his wife before heading home. Every element of that alibi would later be dismantled by investigators. He never had an appointment at the VA hospital that morning. The medication he claimed to be picking up was found sitting on his own desk at work, left there from 3 weeks earlier. Investigators also found that his claim about needing to use a specific Danville pharmacy because the medication was not available elsewhere was false. Crucially, a pharmacy receipt found by investigators showed that Keith had physically circled the time on it, suggesting he was trying to document his presence in Danville at a particular moment to account for his whereabouts. 4 days after the killings, a pastor in Warren, Michigan, named Tracy Herold, called the Danville Police Department. Herold had seen news of the murders on social media and had reached out to Keith, a contact he knew, to check that he was all right. Keith had responded to Harold's message, saying it was the Hockensmiths who had been killed and that he was very upset. Then Keith called Harold directly. What happened during that phone call is what broke the case open. According to lead detective Kevin Peel, Keith immediately launched into a detailed, unsolicited account of exactly where he had been and what he had done on the morning of September 20th, down to specific departure times. He told Harold he left Burnside at 5:47 in the morning. He said he left his shop at 7:17. He named the VA appointment, the pharmacy stop in Danville. He volunteered all of it without being asked a single question about his movements. Harold was unsettled by this. He kept the conversation going and asked Keith whether the murders had been a robbery, whether Michael and Angela had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. That was the moment Keith, in Harold's words, switched like a light switch. His voice changed completely. Harold told investigators he would not have recognised it as the same man speaking. Keith told Harold that the Hockensmiths were not good people. He called them evil. He said they had cost him a great deal of money and that they had gotten what they deserved. He then told Harold that God judges people with a lion judgment and a lamb judgment, and that he had chosen the lion judgment for the Hockensmiths. Harold went back to the police immediately. Investigators began building their case. Surveillance cameras across Danville captured a silver or grey minivan consistent with Keith's vehicle in the area at the relevant time. When detectives obtained a search warrant for Keith's home, church and business, they found maps with the exact route the van had taken highlighted on them. At his pawn shop, they found materials used to construct a homemade gun silencer, and outside the building, .22 caliber shell casings from target practice that matched the casings found at the murder scene. They also found materials from the fake beard, including razors that still had synthetic hair in them. Daniel Smith's receipt briefcase, taken from the crime scene, produced a receipt book that investigators identified as critical physical evidence tying Keith to the victims. Investigators also established that Keith had timed his visit to the shop around Daniel Smith's regular schedule there, knowing that Smith would be carrying a large amount of cash on that particular day. Keith also called the Danville Police Department on the day of the murders itself, before he was a suspect. He offered his assistance and told them to call if there was anything he could do. Investigators noted this at the time. They also noted that while Keith claimed to have had his van detailed the day after the killings, before leaving for a Florida family trip, the timing of that cleaning was of interest. On October 8, 2013, 18 days after the murders, Kenneth Allen Keith was arrested at his Gold Rush gold buyer's shop in Somerset. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, robbery, and burglary. Before his arrest, Keith had attended the funeral of Michael and Angela Hockensmith on September 24th. He stood among the mourners. He offered his condolences to the family. He expressed his grief. Michael's brother, Tony Hockensmith, found out about the arrest later and said it made him sick. The rest of the family was equally devastated when they learned that the man who had come to the funeral, who had sat among them in their grief, was the person investigators believed had killed Michael and Angela. Their mother, Barbara Hockensmith, speaking later to the Oxygen Network programme Final Moments, said the family all came out on the short end of the stick, but that was all right, because she did not have to answer for what Keith did. She said the man was going to have his own demons to live with. Keith also posted sympathy messages on Facebook for the Hockensmith family after the killings and before his arrest, which were documented by investigators and later cited in coverage of the case. The case moved slowly through the courts. Keith's first attorney died in 2014, creating further delays. Competency evaluations were ordered and carried out. Keith was eventually found competent to stand trial. His trial was scheduled to begin in August 2017, nearly 4 years after the killings. Then, in May 2017, a few months before that trial date, Keith met with his defense attorney and his wife and gave a full confession. He admitted to everything. He told them his motive had been that the Hockensmiths had taken his business from him. On May 26, 2017, Kenneth Allen Keith pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with robbery and burglary. The death penalty, which prosecutors had the ability to pursue, was taken off the table as part of the agreement. Keith was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on each murder count, plus 20 years each on the robbery and burglary charges. He was taken directly from the Boyle County Courthouse to prison on the day of sentencing. No trial, no jury. It ended in a single morning. Lead detective Kevin Peel noted one final detail about that day. May 26, 2017, the day Keith pleaded guilty, was Andrew Hockensmith's 13th birthday. The boy who had carried his baby sister to the back room, who had held the phone and told a dispatcher his parents were dead on the ground, turned 13 years old on the day the man responsible finally admitted in court what he had done. Peel said that Andrew's role in the investigation had been critical to the entire outcome. The information he provided, his composure during that 911 call, the description he gave of the shooter including the fake beard, all of it had been foundational to building the case that eventually put Keith in prison for the rest of his life. Kenneth Allen Keith is currently incarcerated at the Eastern Kentucky Correctional Complex in West Liberty, Kentucky. Andrew Hockensmith, now an adult, has spoken publicly about his parents and what he carries from that morning. He told Final Moments that the pawn shop had been his playground as a child, a place he had loved completely. He said his parents will always live on within him. He said he feels in some ways that he is living through a reimagined version of their lives. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case is one of the longest deceptions on this entire list. A teenage girl who helped plan the killing of her best friend, who stood at the graveside and sobbed, and who then spent the next 3 months living inside the dead girl's own home with her grieving mother. She was 16 years old, and it would take 3 years and a jailhouse confession before the truth finally came out. Case 6. Karen Severson, Los Angeles, 1985. Michelle Yvette Avila was born on February 8, 1968, and grew up in the Arleta neighborhood of Los Angeles in the San Fernando Valley. Everyone called her Missy. She was 4 feet 10 inches tall and weighed 97 pounds. She had long auburn hair that fell to her waist and green eyes, and a personality that drew people toward her naturally. She lived with her mother Irene and her 3 brothers. People who knew her described her as sweet, fun, and genuinely kind. She was the kind of teenager who said hello to people she passed in the hallway, who looked out for others, who made the people around her feel liked. Her mother Irene later said that on the afternoon she left home for the last time, she had seemed especially pretty that day. As Laura's car drove away, Missy turned back toward the house and told her mother she loved her. It was not something she said every single day. It was the last thing Irene ever heard her say. The friendship between Missy Avila and Karen Severson had begun when both girls were 8 years old. They had lived on the same street, and from the start they were inseparable. In the early years, Karen was often the one who looked out for Missy, sticking up for her when other kids were unkind. They went through school together, shared secrets, spent enormous amounts of time in each other's homes, and for years, the friendship appeared to be one of the most solid things in either of their lives. That changed when high school started. Missy became increasingly popular, especially with boys. She was seen by others as more attractive and socially successful than Karen. Karen started to pull back, and the jealousy that had been quietly building began to shape how she saw everything about her oldest friend. When Missy began spending more time with boys than with her, Karen took it as a personal rejection. She began spreading rumors at school, claiming that Missy had been intimate with multiple boys, including boys who were already in relationships with other girls. The consequences for Missy were severe and physical. Girls who believed those rumors confronted her and attacked her outside of school. The rumors did lasting damage to her reputation among people who did not know her well enough to know better. In junior year, Missy briefly dated a boy named Randy Fernandez. The relationship lasted roughly a month before she ended it because his lifestyle of constant partying did not suit her. Almost immediately after that breakup, Karen began a relationship with Randy herself, and the two moved into an apartment together. Karen later claimed she had seen Randy flirting with Missy at a party, though Missy had reportedly told him she was not interested in rekindling anything. Whatever the full truth of that situation, the effect on Karen was decisive. She stopped speaking to Missy entirely. By the summer of 1985, Karen had urged Randy to throw lit firecrackers at Missy as a demonstration of his loyalty. He did it. The hostility had long since stopped being the kind of thing that passes between teenagers. It had become something deliberate and ongoing. Laura Doyle was part of the same social circle. She shared Karen's resentment toward Missy and had her own grievances about the same situation involving boyfriends. By September 1985, Karen and Laura were working together against Missy. On September 21st, just 10 days before the murder, Karen confronted Missy physically at a neighborhood park. Witnesses saw her threaten Missy with a broken beer bottle before pushing and slapping her. Other people stepped in and broke it up. Afterward, the girls apparently made some kind of surface-level peace. Missy believed the worst of it was behind her. She had no knowledge of what was being arranged. October 1st, 1985. Missy told her mother she was going out with her friend Laura Doyle. Laura picked her up at the Avila home. Irene watched them drive away. The plan, as it turned out, had been coordinated in advance. Laura and Missy would meet Karen and another girl, Eva Chirambolo, at Stonehurst Park in Sun Valley. From there, 2 cars would drive to the Colby Ranch area of the Angeles National Forest, a place teenagers in the area used regularly as a hangout spot. Missy had been there before. She had no reason to think the afternoon was anything other than a trip into the hills with friends. Eva Chirambolo later testified that Karen had told her and Laura they were planning to frighten Missy that day. Eva said she had not understood how far things would go. She followed the group from a distance as all 4 girls walked down a dirt path from the parking area toward Big Tuhunga Creek, roughly 100 to 200 yards into the trees. At the creek, Karen and Laura turned on Missy. They screamed at her. They accused her of having been intimate with their boyfriends and told her she had destroyed too many relationships. Missy was crying. She was 4 feet 10 inches and 97 pounds. Karen weighed 200 pounds. Laura was 5 feet 6 and 135 pounds. What came next was not a confrontation between equals. Karen held Missy down and shoved her face into the shallow creek water. The water was approximately 6 to 8 inches deep. Laura helped hold her. During the struggle, Missy's long auburn hair was torn and cut away in chunks. The hair she had worn her entire life, hacked off and left in the water and on the bank. When Missy stopped moving, Karen and Laura found a log. It was approximately 4 to 5 feet long and weighed close to 100 pounds. They placed it directly across Missy's body to hold her face down in the water. Then they walked back to their cars and drove home. Eva Chirambolo testified that when Karen got to her car, Laura said to her, "We killed Missy." Then Laura said Missy deserved it. 4 hours after Missy was killed, Laura called the Avila home and asked to speak to her. When Irene told Laura she thought Missy was with her, Laura gave her the story they had prepared. She said she had dropped Missy off with 3 boys in a blue Camaro while she went to get petrol. She said when she came back, Missy and the boys were gone. Irene began making calls immediately and reported her daughter missing the following day. On October 4th, 1985, hikers found Missy's body face down in the creek in Big Tuhunga Canyon in the Angeles National Forest. The log was across her back. Her hair was gone. Her face showed the injuries from the struggle. She was 17 years old. When police told Irene Avila that her daughter had been found, Irene collapsed. She fainted again at the funeral and had to be taken to hospital by ambulance. Karen Severson and Laura Doyle were both at that funeral. They stood among the mourners. They comforted Missy's family. Laura sent Irene a sympathy card with $20 enclosed after the service. Both of them spoke about how devastating the loss was and how much they wanted whoever did this to be found. Then Karen moved in. After Missy's funeral, Karen Severson brought herself and her 2-year-old daughter to live in Irene Avila's home. According to the U.S. federal court habeas documents, the California Court of Appeal summaries, the Daily News, Fox News, the Courthouse News lawsuit filing from the Avila family, and Wikipedia's sourced account, Severson lived with Irene for an extended period during which the case remained unsolved. The Avila family's own lawsuit described what Severson did during that time as a campaign of misdirection and obfuscation. She directed friends and family to conduct fruitless searches based on her lies and misstatements. She suggested possible suspects. She participated in the investigation. She stayed close to Irene to monitor exactly what police knew and how close they were getting. During the same period, the lawsuit noted, many of Missy's possessions were removed from the family home, including photographs, jewellery, and personal recordings of Missy and Severson together. Karen herself later admitted in her own words that she had 2 reasons for staying close to the family. She said she felt a sick obligation to be there for them because she had known them for years. And she said she also wanted to know how the investigation was progressing, who the suspects were, and what evidence investigators had found. She visited Missy's grave multiple times a week. She covered the walls of her room with photographs of Missy and newspaper clippings about the crime. She went back to the creek where Missy's body had been found, returning to the scene with groups of friends and family who were genuinely trying to help solve the murder. She told Irene at one point that she had seen Missy's ghost, that Missy appeared to her sitting on the couch, that Missy floated over her while she slept, that Missy's spirit had once prevented her car from starting when she went to visit the grave. Irene later said she had hoped, if it was possible, that Missy was doing exactly that. The case went cold. Investigators had no solid leads. Laura Doyle had given her blue Camaro story. The description of 3 unknown boys led nowhere. 3 years passed with no arrest, no charges, and no answers for Irene Avila. She had spent that time living alongside, grieving alongside, and being consoled by one of the people who had killed her daughter. What broke the case open was Eva Chirimbolo's brother dying by suicide. In the wake of that loss, Eva was confronted in a new way with what it means to grieve someone suddenly taken. She had been carrying the knowledge of what happened at that creek for 3 years. On July 26, 1988, Eva went to police and told them the truth about the murder of Michelle Avila. In exchange for her full cooperation, she was not charged as an accessory. The following day, Karen Severson and Laura Doyle were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The arrest was a shock to everyone in the Avila family who had known and trusted both girls. The trial began in January 1990 at Pasadena Superior Court. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Tamia Hope, argued that Severson and Doyle had lured Missy to the forest, confronted her with accusations about her relationships with their boyfriends, and then deliberately held her down in the creek until she died. Eva Chirimbolo testified for the prosecution about what she had witnessed and heard that day. The defense argued that the killing had not been planned and was not first-degree murder. On January 31, 1990, the jury convicted both Karen Severson and Laura Doyle of second-degree murder. The jurors said they were not convinced the killing had been premeditated in a way that met the standard for first-degree murder, viewing it instead as a crime driven by sudden passion rather than prior planning. Prosecutors strongly disagreed with that conclusion. The lead prosecutor on the case later stated publicly that the crime had been a deliberate, well-planned act that needed to be treated as such. Both were sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Karen Severson was 22 years old at sentencing. Laura Doyle was the same age. Both women served more than 2 decades behind bars. Severson was released on parole in December 2011, having served 21.5 years. Doyle was released in December 2012 after 22 years. Irene Avila, who was 72 at the time of Doyle's release, told the Daily News that she hated her. She said both of them should have faced the death penalty. She said they were free while her daughter was in the ground. After her release, Severson began promoting a memoir about the crime and her prison experience and pursued a deal to have a film produced about it. The Avila family sued her in 2015 to try to stop her from profiting from the killing. The state of California responded to the case by passing a law named after Missy, known as Missy's Law, which requires anyone helping a convicted criminal publish work about their crime to contact the victim's family first before publication. Missy's family described the situation as fighting for Missy's life all over again. Irene Avila has spoken publicly about the case for decades. She has been asked repeatedly why she did not know, why she could not feel that the woman in her home had killed her daughter. She has said she had no reason to suspect either of them. She welcomed Karen into her grief as a daughter and never once imagined the truth. The question she kept returning to, the one she said she would never fully stop asking herself, was a simple one. She was her mother. Why didn't she know? Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes place in England in 1993, and it involves a killer who did not move into the victim's family home and did not spend years constructing an alibi. He simply showed up at the funeral, wearing the exact same jacket he had been wearing when he committed the killing. He sat among the mourners, including the victim's own parents, who were friends with his parents. And then he went home and said nothing for the next 22 years. Case 7. Colin Ash Smith, Kent, UK, 1993. Colin Ash Smith was born in 1968 and grew up in Swanscombe, a small town in Kent on the south bank of the Thames estuary, about 20 miles east of London. It was the kind of place where most people knew each other at least by name. Families went to the same clubs, their kids went to the same schools, and when something bad happened to someone, the whole community felt it. That familiarity would become one of the most disturbing details of what Ash Smith eventually did, because the family of the girl he killed were not strangers to him. They were people his own parents knew well. His mother and father, Diane and Aubrey Ash Smith, were active and respected figures locally. Diane had served as a ward councillor in Swanscombe and Greenhithe and would later become town mayor. Aubrey was a committee member at the Greenhithe and Swanscombe Royal British Legion Club. They were involved, civic-minded people. Their son was their only child. By all outward appearances, the family was unremarkable in the way that makes what comes next so hard to understand. The picture that would eventually emerge of Colin Ash Smith from inside his own home, in private, was something entirely different from what the neighbourhood saw. By his own admission at his later trial, Ash Smith had developed a serious and dangerous fixation on knives and violence toward women from at least the late 1980s. He told the court he collected between 20 and 30 knives at various points, including commando knives, sheath knives, and flick knives. He described going on what he called midnight walks after his parents went to bed, walking the streets alone with the hope of encountering someone. He told the jury he carried weapons because it made him feel powerful at a time when he described himself as having a very limited moral compass. He kept handwritten notes he referred to as assault plans, documents in which he rated and ranked his attacks on women and wrote about others he had planned and abandoned. In one entry, he wrote that he would kill a schoolgirl, adding that it sounded impressive. These were not the thoughts of a person in a single moment of crisis. These were the thoughts of someone who had been building toward violence for years. Before Claire Tiltman was killed, Ash Smith had already carried out one serious violent attack on a woman. On December 21, 1988, in Swanscombe, he abducted a 27-year-old woman at gunpoint, forced her to a quarry, and carried out a prolonged violent assault that nearly killed her. He used his old school tie during the attack and stabbed her multiple times in the back before she managed to survive. He was not caught for this crime at the time. He walked away, returned home, and went on with his life. In his private handwritten notes, he later described the 1988 attack as his masterpiece and rated it 95% successful. He kept those notes. He appears to have been proud of them. Claire Tiltman was born on January 14, 1977, and grew up in Stone, a small area near Greenhithe in the borough of Dartford. She was the only child of Cliff and Linda Tiltman. Her friends called her Tilts. She was a Year 11 student at Dartford Grammar School for Girls, working toward her GCSEs and pursuing her Bronze Duke of Edinburgh Award at Dartford Fire Station. She had dreams of becoming a firefighter. People who knew her described her as popular, warm, and full of energy. She was 16 years old. She had just celebrated her birthday 4 days before she was killed. She knew the Ash Smith family the same way most local families knew each other, through the Royal British Legion Club where both families were members. She and Colin Ash Smith were not close, but they were not strangers either. On the evening of Monday, January 18, 1993, Claire left her home in Woodward Terrace, Horns Cross, Stone, at around 6 in the evening. She was walking to a friend's house in Riverview Road, Greenhithe, a distance of just under 1 mile. At some point, she took a detour along the A226 London Road, believed to be heading to a shop near Knockhall Chase to buy cigarettes, before continuing to her friend's place. She turned into a narrow, dark alleyway off London Road in Greenhithe. It was around 6:20 in the evening. Ash Smith attacked her from behind. He stabbed her 9 times with a large knife. The pathologist later noted that the wounds to her outer jacket showed she had been struck many more times than 9, with 9 of those blows actually penetrating her body. She stumbled out of the alleyway and collapsed on a low brick wall near the pavement. A passerby stopped and tried to help her. Another man ran to a nearby pub to call for an ambulance. A member of the public performed CPR. By the time the ambulance crew arrived, Claire Tiltman was gone. Ash Smith had already walked back along the streets of Greenhithe to the house in nearby Swanscombe, where he was living with his parents. He was 24 years old. There was no robbery. There was no prior confrontation. Prosecutor Brian Altman QC would later tell the court at Ash Smith's trial that this was a killing for the sake of killing. Claire had not been targeted for any reason relating to who she was as a person. She had simply been in the wrong place. Kent Police launched one of the largest investigations in the force's history, called Operation Artist. Officers took over 1,500 statements and received thousands of tips from across the country after Claire's picture appeared on the front pages of national newspapers. A reward of £1,000 was offered. The search covered the local area extensively. Her parents, Cliff and Linda, gave press conferences, sat through police briefings, and kept their daughter's name in front of the public for years. None of it produced a charge. The case went cold. What happened next would only be understood much later. In the days immediately after the killing, Ash Smith called the police incident room. He claimed to have been driving through the area on the evening of January 18th and said he had seen a man with dark, curly hair using a pedestrian crossing near Knockhall Chase at around 6:30 in the evening. He was calling to offer information. What he was actually doing was establishing a reason for himself, or his distinctive white Ford Capri, to have been seen near Greenhithe at that time, in case any witness had placed him there. 6 days later, when police spoke to him formally, he gave a different account, saying he had driven his mother to visit a constituent in Eynsford Road before returning home to Swanscombe by 6 o'clock. His mother Diane, who was a ward councillor at the time, provided an alibi backing this account. Then he attended Claire's funeral. The Ash Smith family came to pay their respects as members of the same community and the same British Legion Club. Colin Ash Smith stood among the mourners, among Claire's family and friends, among people whose lives had been completely destroyed by what he had done. He was wearing a light-coloured waist-length jacket. Multiple witnesses had told police in the days after the killing that they had seen a man in a light-coloured waist-length jacket walking down London Road in the area around the time Claire was killed. This was the jacket, the one he had on the night he stabbed her. He wore it to her funeral. He did not change it. He did not hide it. He stood in that church in the same clothes and showed no sign that anything about the situation was in any way connected to him. No charges came. The investigation continued but stalled. There was no forensic evidence placing Ash Smith at the scene. His alibi held. The case remained open but inactive for years. In October 1995, 2.5 years after Claire was killed, Ash Smith attacked again. He came across Charlotte Barnard, a 21-year-old healthcare assistant, walking in Greenhithe less than 400 metres from the alleyway where Claire had been killed. He stabbed her 14 times and left her for dead. She survived. Ash Smith was arrested hours later. When police searched his white Ford Capri, they found half of a school tie, the same school tie that had been used during the 1988 attack on the woman in Swanscombe Quarry. That connected him to the earlier crime instantly. He was questioned about Claire Tiltman's death during the 1995 investigation, but police could not find enough evidence to charge him with her killing. His mother's alibi still stood. There was no forensic link. He denied any involvement. In December 1996, he pleaded guilty at Maidstone Crown Court to the 1988 and 1995 attacks. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge at that sentencing told him his aggressive and sadistic patterns made him far too dangerous to be free. He went to prison and began serving that sentence. The case of Claire Tiltman formally remained open, but without new evidence there was nowhere for it to go. Then something happened inside prison that would eventually unravel everything. Between 2001 and 2003, while serving his sentence at HMP Wakefield, Ash Smith shared a cell at various points with a man named Stéphane Dubois. Dubois later testified that Ash Smith told him about attacking a woman he had seen using a zebra crossing. He said Ash Smith described seeing the woman and then snapping and going after her. At the time Dubois heard this, he assumed Ash Smith was describing one of the 2 attacks he was already imprisoned for, but investigators later established that neither the 1988 Swanscombe Quarry attack nor the 1995 Charlotte Barnard attack had involved a zebra crossing. The only attack in the area matching that description was the killing of Claire Tiltman, who had been crossing the road near Knockhall Chase shortly before she was found in that alleyway. The detail Ash Smith had given Dubois was specific enough to point at only one crime. He had also, by multiple accounts, boasted inside prison about being referred to locally as the Swanscombe Psycho. He appeared to take some satisfaction in the name. Meanwhile, outside prison, Claire's friends refused to let her case be forgotten. A group that came to call themselves Justice for Claire, including school friends Joanne Roberts, Vicky Atkins, Lisa Gribbin and others, organised memorial events and kept the investigation alive in the public consciousness. On the 20th anniversary of the killing in January 2013, they organised a candlelit walk in Greenhithe that retraced Claire's last steps, carrying copies of her photograph and calling for anyone with information to come forward. Claire's father Cliff had made a public appeal for information in April 2012 on the 19th anniversary. Neither Cliff nor Linda Tiltman would live to see the outcome. Both died before the case came to trial. In 2010, the Kent Police Cold Case Unit received Home Office funding to re-examine Claire's case using modern forensic techniques. By 2013, the Kent and Essex Serious Crime Directorate had built enough of a picture to move forward. In September 2013, officers searched the family home where Ash Smith's father Aubrey still lived, in Myrtle Place, Stone. They found a copy of a local newspaper from the first anniversary of Claire's death that Ash Smith had kept. During the search, Aubrey Ash Smith spoke to a local reporter and maintained his son's innocence, saying police had lost the plot. He himself had been convicted and jailed for 12 months in 1997 for dismantling, boiling down and disposing of a large army knife that had belonged to his son, discovered after the 1995 arrest. The sentencing judge in that case had told him his actions had caused questions to be raised about his son's involvement in Claire's death and had prolonged the suffering of Claire's parents. The jacket from the funeral was also examined. Police had tested it after Ash Smith's 1995 arrest and found no forensic trace linking it to the night Claire was killed. It was later returned to the family. When investigators searched known addresses during the 2013 cold case review, the jacket could not be found. On February 12, 2014, the Crown Prosecution Service announced that Colin Ash Smith would be charged with the murder of Claire Tiltman. The timing was notable. He had been due to appear before the parole board that same day to have his release considered in relation to the 1988 and 1995 sentences. He was charged instead. A key factor in making the prosecution possible was a change in the law. The Criminal Justice Act 2003 had introduced provisions allowing jurors in certain cases to hear evidence of a defendant's past convictions and history of behaviour, what the law calls bad character evidence. Under the rules that existed in 1993, the details of the 1988 and 1995 attacks would almost certainly not have been heard by a jury in Claire's trial. Under the 2003 Act, the judge, Mr. Justice Sweeney, allowed all of it in. The jury would hear about the 1988 quarry attack, the 1995 stabbing of Charlotte Barnard, the handwritten assault plans, the diary entries, the notes in which he had written about killing a schoolgirl. The Crown described him as a ruthless, predatory, armed killer who had planned multiple attacks and taken pleasure in what he did. Prosecutor Brian Altman, QC, told the jury this was a killing for the sake of killing, and that given the chance, he would have harmed many more women. Ash Smith gave evidence himself. He told the court he was an animal in relation to the 1988 and 1995 attacks, using his own word. He admitted collecting knives, writing the assault plans, going on midnight walks. He said he had been in a psycho state of mind in relation to various incidents. He told the jury that between 1988 and 1995, he had managed to keep those impulses controlled, and that the evening Claire was killed had been just another day for him. He denied being in the alleyway. He denied killing her. He denied lying to protect his family, even though he acknowledged that any connection to Claire's death would cause his parents enormous pain. His defence team raised the name of Robert Napper, a serial violent offender who had carried out a series of attacks on women in southeast England in the early 1990s, as an alternative suspect. They also challenged the credibility of Stéphane Dubois, and pointed out that there was no direct physical evidence placing Ash Smith at the scene of Claire's killing. The jury of 7 men and 5 women took 3.5 hours to return a unanimous verdict. On December 11, 2014, Colin Ash Smith was found guilty of the murder of Claire Tiltman. The following day, December 12th, Mr. Justice Sweeney sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years before he could even be considered for parole. The judge noted that because the crime had been committed in 1993, sentencing had to follow the guidelines in place at that time. He stated that had the murder been committed after 2003, the minimum term would have been 30 years. He described the killing as premeditated, noting that Ash Smith had selected Claire as a vulnerable target and that his intention had been to kill. He told Ash Smith he only had himself to blame for not coming forward when he was arrested in 1995, and that his silence had prolonged the suffering of Claire's family through all the years that followed. The Crown Prosecution Service said after the verdict that Ash Smith was a man who was always looking, always stalking, always looking to harm women, and that the conviction had prevented further harm. In December 2015, Ash Smith applied for leave to appeal his conviction on the basis that Mr. Justice Sweeney had wrongly allowed the bad character evidence before the jury. 3 senior judges rejected the appeal. In 2016, after Ash Smith's father Aubrey died, Ash Smith was not granted temporary release to attend the funeral. A floral tribute spelling the word Dad in blue ribbon was sent on his behalf. After the verdict, Tiltman Avenue was created in Greenhithe in April 2016, when Dartford Borough Council approved the renaming of a local road in Claire's memory, following a campaign by residents and friends. Stone Parish Council named a new community centre, the Claire Tiltman Centre. The Justice for Claire campaign wound down after achieving what it had set out to do. The website was taken offline. The women who had spent years keeping Claire's name alive finally had their answer. For Cliff and Linda Tiltman, who spent the rest of their lives without knowing who killed their daughter or why, justice came too late. They never sat in that courtroom. They never heard the verdict. They died waiting. Detective Superintendent Rob Vinson of Kent Police said after the trial that every single officer who had worked on the case across 2 decades had refused to allow Claire's killer to go unaccounted for, and that the team had built the case meticulously over many years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next killer on this list did not wait 22 years to be caught. He sat next to the grieving family of his victim from the moment they lowered the coffin, carried the casket on his own shoulder, and delivered a speech at the grave. Jeffrey Skullin Jr. was the pallbearer. The woman in the casket was the mother of his fiancée, and he was the one who had killed her. Case 8. Randolph Sanders, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 2015. Kim Jones was born and raised in North Philadelphia. She grew up in that city, built her career there, and spent most of her adult life trying to make it better for the families who had the least. By the time she was in her 50s, she had built something meaningful. She had a master's degree in business administration. She had spent roughly 7 years working as the program director of the Families and Schools Together program, known as FAST, at a non-profit called Turning Points for Children. The program operated across 62 schools in Philadelphia, working directly with low-income parents and their children to build family stability and keep kids engaged in school. It was funded through the city's Department of Human Services. It was, by every account from people who knew her, exactly the kind of work she was built for. Her son Andre Jordan described her in the days after she was killed as 100% selfless. He said her life was helping other people, that she worked just as hard volunteering at a church soup kitchen as she did running a non-profit, and that it was her passion. He said she was a great person who deserved a lot better than what happened to her. In December 2014, around 25 years after her first marriage ended, Kim Jones remarried. She was 56 years old and by all accounts genuinely happy. Sanders was invited to the wedding. He attended and later told a television reporter the day after her death that she had been incredibly happy and that it had been a wonderful occasion. He said he was fortunate to have been there. About 30 days after that wedding, he killed her. Randolph Sanders was 36 years old in January 2015. He had no prior criminal record. He held a master's degree in education and had a background working in social services. Jones had hired him roughly 2 years earlier as the assistant director of the FAST program. He worked directly under her, earning $68,000 a year. He handled the administrative side of program finances, which included processing payment vouchers used as stipends for school volunteers who participated in the program. At some point during his time in that role, Sanders began redirecting those vouchers. Investigators later established that he had stolen approximately $40,000 from the organization by manipulating the payment system. He processed funds in ways that diverted money away from the program and toward himself. He had been doing this without detection, but by January 2015, Kim Jones had noticed that money was missing. She had begun asking questions. She had confronted Sanders about the discrepancies. She told him she believed funds had been mismanaged and that she was going to find out exactly what had happened. Sanders knew what she was going to find. On the morning of January 13, 2015, Kim Jones had a meeting scheduled with the Department of Human Services, the city agency that funded Turning Points for Children. That meeting was going to be about the missing money. It was the kind of meeting that ends careers and leads to criminal charges. Sanders knew about the meeting. He knew what it meant. He decided it was not going to happen. That morning, he packed a handgun into a duffel bag. He knew Kim Jones's routine. He knew that she left her home in the Yorktown neighborhood of North Philadelphia each morning and walked half a block to the corner of 12th and Jefferson Streets to catch the Route 23 SEPTA bus into Center City. He walked to that area, found a spot to wait, and laid in wait for her. Jones arrived at the bus stop at around 9:15 in the morning. She stood leaning against a short brick retaining wall. She had her headphones in and was listening to gospel music. She was not aware of anyone approaching. Sanders came up behind her on an inclined lawn, pulled the handgun from his duffel bag, pointed it at the back of her head, and fired once. Kim Jones collapsed. She died at the scene. He walked away calmly. Surveillance cameras in the area captured what happened next, in a sequence that investigators were later able to piece together into a full picture of his escape route. The footage showed him walking away from the bus stop and crossing through Temple University's campus nearby. He went down into the Broad Street subway at Cecil B. Moore Station, rode northbound to the Hunting Park stop, came back up to street level, and walked a short distance along Hunting Park Avenue to Carlisle Street. There, parked and waiting, was his silver 2007 GMC Yukon. He got in and drove away westbound on Hunting Park Avenue. Within minutes of leaving the scene, he called Kim Jones's phone. He left a voicemail. He said he hadn't seen her that morning and asked if she was okay. Homicide Captain James Clark later said at a press conference that calling her phone that way was one of the most calculated things he had seen an alleged killer do. It was Sanders trying to establish that he had no idea what had happened to her, that he was just a concerned colleague checking in. It was also one of the most chilling details of the entire case. The following day, January 14th, a reporter from 6ABC Philadelphia named Vernon Odom arrived at Turning Points for Children to speak with colleagues about Kim Jones's death. Sanders sat down for the interview. He was wearing a plaid scarf and had a well-groomed beard. He shook his head slowly. He looked directly at the camera. He said, "We are all just stunned. Just stunned. Just stunned." He said it 3 times. He told the reporter he had been fortunate enough to be invited to Kim's wedding. He said she had been incredibly happy. He said the whole thing was just disturbing. He had killed her less than 24 hours earlier. He then attended her funeral at the Church of the Advocate at 18th and Diamond Streets in North Philadelphia. He stood among her family, her friends, her colleagues, and the community she had served. He walked up to Andre Jordan, Kim's son. He extended his hand. He said he was sorry for his loss. Andre Jordan shook his hand. It was the last time the 2 men were in the same room before Sanders was arrested. The investigation was led by the Philadelphia Police Homicide Unit under Captain James Clark. Detectives worked around the clock for 3 weeks, combing through hundreds of hours of surveillance footage from cameras across the surrounding neighborhood and transit system. The footage of the shooting itself showed a hooded figure in all black, face partially obscured, pull a weapon from a bag and fire. The gunman had clearly been aware of camera positions, looking away at certain angles. But investigators were patient and methodical. They built a map of his movements from the bus stop at 12th and Jefferson, all the way to where he collected his vehicle near Hunting Park. That Yukon became the thread that unravelled everything. The vehicle had a distinctive sticker on the rear. Once detectives had clear images of it from the footage, they began searching for that specific combination of make, model, year, colour, and sticker across the area. The search eventually led them to a 2007 silver GMC Yukon registered to a man connected to Turning Points for Children. Sanders had not been considered a primary suspect initially. He had given the TV interview, he had attended the funeral, he had shown up to the office, grieved with colleagues, and participated in the community's response to the killing like everyone else. His vehicle put a different shape on all of that. On January 31st, 2015, 18 days after Kim Jones was killed, Philadelphia police went to the 9,000 block of Ryerson Road in northeast Philadelphia. The silver Yukon was parked outside. Sanders was arrested at that address. He was brought to the homicide unit for questioning. Detectives questioned him. On Saturday, February 1st, he confessed. He gave a verbal account that was transcribed by homicide detectives and then recorded on video. In the video, he described the killing as a work-related matter that just got out of hand. He said Kim Jones had confronted him about the missing money the day before and told him she was going to report him. He said he feared losing his $68,000 a year job. He said he feared the damage to his reputation. He said he had meant to scare her, not kill her. He said he did not know what was going on in his mind. He said he wished it had never happened. Captain James Clark held a press conference. He called it a premeditated assassination-style murder. Deputy Commissioner Richard Ross stood beside him and said it was the type of case that leaves you both angry and confounded. He said it breaks your heart. 3 guns were recovered from Sanders' home during the search following his arrest. The specific weapon used in the killing was never located. At his arraignment in the early hours of Monday, February 2nd, Sanders was charged with first-degree murder and multiple firearms offences and ordered held without bail. Andre Jordan released a statement to the Philadelphia Daily News that same day. He said he had talked with Sanders, joked with him, and considered him a normal person with a normal head on his shoulders. He said he was wrong. He said the fact that Sanders could look any member of his family in the eye and shake his hand at the funeral was just flat out unimaginable. He said he was putting his faith in the justice system to give Sanders what he deserved for taking the life of a respected, generous, and selfless woman who did nothing but try to help people. Andre Jordan's brother Jean-Paul was less measured. He told NBC10 that Sanders was an absolute scumbag and that shooting a human being in broad daylight in front of people and walking away from a corner said everything about who he was. The trial took place in 2017 at the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas. The case was prosecuted by Assistant District Attorney Mark Levenberg. Sanders was represented by defense attorney Michael Cord. The jury consisted of 7 men and 5 women. The prosecution's case rested on the surveillance footage, the vehicle identification, the call Sanders placed to Kim Jones's voicemail minutes after the shooting, and his own videotaped confession. ADA Levenberg pointed to Sanders' education level and his own admission in court that he understood his right not to incriminate himself as evidence that the confession had been given knowingly and should be taken seriously. Levenberg argued there was no credible interpretation of the evidence other than that Sanders had planned this killing specifically to prevent Kim Jones from exposing his theft. The defense argued that the confession had been obtained after approximately 30 hours of questioning and that Sanders had been worn down by the process. Sanders took the stand. He told the jury he had not committed the crime. He said he had not stolen any money and had not done this to Kim. He said he would never have done this to Kim. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. Sanders sat at the defense table and rubbed his face with his hands as the foreman announced the verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Glenn B. Bronson sentenced him immediately. First-degree murder in Pennsylvania carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Bronson imposed that sentence and added consecutive terms of 8.5 to 17 years for the 3 firearms charges. Before sentencing, Bronson told the court that the evidence in this case had been some of the most overwhelming he had seen in 35 years as a judge and as a lawyer. After the sentence was delivered, Sanders spoke. He thanked the judge for a fair trial. He said he was sorry for the entire situation. He said he understood what was shown on the video. Then he said he still stood by his innocence. Bronson did not respond. Randolph Sanders was taken directly to prison, where he will remain for the rest of his life. He was 39 at sentencing. Kim Jones was 56 when she died. She had been married for 30 days. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves a man who did not try to hide behind a performance of grief. He did not give TV interviews or call the victim's phone. He went further than almost anyone else on this list. He agreed to carry the casket. Jeffrey Skullin Jr. was the pallbearer at the funeral of the woman he had killed, and he stood at her graveside with her daughter, the woman he was engaged to marry, as she watched her mother go into the ground. Case 9. Brian Draper, Pocatello, Idaho, 2006. Cassie Jo Stoddart was born on December 21, 1989, in Pocatello, Idaho. She was 16 years old when she died, a junior at Pocatello High School. People who knew her described her as responsible, warm, and easy to be around. She earned good grades and had a passion for music and drawing. Her family trusted her completely, which was why her aunt and uncle, Allison and Frank Contreras, had asked her to house-sit for the weekend at their home on Whispering Cliffs Drive in northeast Bannock County. She would look after their 3 cats and 2 dogs while they were out of town. It was the kind of job you give to someone you know will handle it well. Cassie was that person. Her mother Anna dropped her and her boyfriend Matt Beckham off at the Contreras house around 5:30 in the afternoon on Friday, September 22, 2006. Cassie called home around 9:30 that night to say everything was fine. They were just watching movies. She said she would call the next day. Anna said goodnight. That was the last conversation they ever had. The 2 people who killed Cassie Jo Stoddart were also 16 years old. They were her classmates, and they considered themselves her friends. Their names were Brian Lee Draper and Tori Michael Adamczyk. Brian Draper was born in Sandy, Utah, and had moved with his family to Pocatello during his school years. He met Tori Adamczyk when they were both sophomores at Pocatello High. Both boys were into filmmaking and had started recording short videos together. On the surface, that was a shared hobby that made sense for 2 teenagers who liked movies. What was happening beneath the surface was something else entirely. Draper had developed a deep fixation on mass killers, particularly Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who carried out the Columbine High School shooting in 1999. He later said in a 2012 documentary that Columbine had created a kind of underground identity for teenagers who felt like they did not belong, and that what those killers had done gave them a kind of fame he wanted for himself. He said he saw them transcend their high school and be in the spotlight, and that was what he wanted. Adamczyk was separately obsessed with the 1996 horror film Scream, a movie about a masked killer hunting teenagers. The fictional killer in Scream wore a white ghost face mask and used a knife. At some point, the 2 boys stopped talking about movies and started talking about making one of their own. Except the version they were planning would not be fiction. Starting roughly 3 weeks before the night of September 22nd, Draper and Adamczyk began building toward what they described in their own recordings as the ultimate act. They created a death list, a handwritten collection of names of people they wanted to target. The list included Cassie and her boyfriend Matt. They acquired knives. An 18-year-old acquaintance named Lucero purchased 4 knives for them at a pawn shop using $45 in total, $40 of which came from Draper. Draper made a specific point of claiming ownership of the one knife with a serrated blade. They bought gloves. They bought masks, white ones that they painted to look like the Ghostface mask from the Scream films. They filmed themselves at various points discussing the plan, rating their excitement, and talking about what they were going to do and why. In one recording made in the school library, they are seen creating their death list. In another, filmed on the morning of September 22nd, the camera captures Cassie at her locker. She gives a casual wave toward whoever is filming. She has no idea what those boys are planning for that night. In the late afternoon of September 22nd, Draper and Adamczyk drove to the Contreras house on Whispering Cliffs Drive and arrived to find Cassie already there with Matt. The 4 of them settled in and watched Kill Bill Volume 2 together. Cassie showed them around the house, including the basement. While they were inside, Draper slipped away and quietly unlocked the basement door. This was intentional. It was so they could get back inside later after leaving. The four teenagers sat together for roughly 2 hours. Sometime around 9:30 in the evening, Draper and Adamczyk said goodbye and left. They did not go far. They drove to a spot down the street and pulled over. Draper picked up the camera. He recorded the two of them sitting in the car, describing what was about to happen. He said the time was 9:50 on September 22nd, 2006. He said they unfortunately had the grueling task of killing their two friends, and that their friends were right in that house just down the street. Adamczyk said they had just talked to them. Draper said he had unlocked a back door and everything was ready and that they just had to wait. They talked about being nervous. They listened to Pink Floyd. They talked about how long they had waited for this. Then they drove back. But Matt Beckham was still there. That part had not been part of the plan. Draper and Adamczyk snuck in through the basement door, wearing their dark clothing, gloves, and painted masks. They hid in the basement and made noise, attempting to draw Cassie and Matt downstairs. When that did not work, they went to the fuse box and cut the power to the entire house. The sudden blackout frightened both teenagers. Matt wanted to stay, but his parents called him home. He was picked up at around 11:15 in the evening. Before he left, he touched the fuse box while trying to restore the power, leaving fingerprints that investigators would find 2 days later. His mother later told police she heard Cassie's voice from inside the house as Matt came out the door. Cassie was alone. Draper and Adamczyk came up from the basement and moved through the dark house to find her. They attacked her in the living room. She fought back. Idaho State Police Captain John Gansky, who worked the case, said it was clear that Cassie had put up an extreme fight and that she had fought for her life. She was stabbed 29 times. The medical examiner later determined that the fatal wounds were made with a serrated blade, consistent with the knife Draper had specifically claimed as his own. After the attack, the boys left the house, got back into the car, and drove away. Then they filmed themselves again. The footage recorded after the killing showed them reacting to what had just happened, with what investigators described as excitement and satisfaction. On the tape, one of them says they are sick people who get pleasure out of what they did. They talked about wanting to be like the killers in Scream. They drove out to a remote area near Black Rock Canyon in the hills outside Pocatello and buried everything. The knives, the gloves, the masks, the dark clothing, and the video camera with all the footage on it. They tried to burn the videotape. They did not succeed in destroying it. Then they went home. On Sunday, September 24th, 2 days after Cassie was killed, the Contreras family returned home. A relative made the 911 call. Responding officers found Cassie on the floor. There was a significant amount of blood. The crime scene made clear that she had not gone down without a fight. Cassie's mother, Anna, was told her daughter was dead. She later described it as a complete state of shock and said she could not understand who could have done something like that. The investigation began immediately. There was no sign of forced entry, which told investigators whoever had been inside had known the house or had been let in. Nothing had been stolen. The fuse box in the basement had been tampered with, and there were fingerprints on it. Those fingerprints initially matched Anna's boyfriend, who had done repair work at the house previously. He was briefly looked at as a person of interest, but had a firm alibi and was quickly cleared. Matt Beckham was the last known person to have seen Cassie alive. Investigators noted that his reaction when told she was dead seemed flat, and they found that worth examining. He agreed to take a polygraph test. He passed. But during his conversations with detectives, he mentioned something that changed the direction of the case entirely. He told them that 2 other classmates had also been at the Contreras house that Friday night, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk. Detectives brought in both boys for questioning. Both told the same story. After leaving the house, they had gone downtown to see a movie called Pulse at a local theatre. When investigators pressed them for details about the film, neither could describe anything about it. A theatre employee who went to school with them confirmed they had not been there. Captain Gansky said in his Dateline interview that his team knew at that point that the boys were lying, and that the question became why. Confronted with the fact that the movie alibi had fallen apart, Draper changed his story. He told investigators that he and Adamczyk had spent the evening breaking into cars parked in the area and had lied about the movie because they did not want to get into trouble for that. Investigators did not believe it. They told Draper he was going to take a polygraph test. Just before the test was about to begin, Draper broke. He told investigators he needed to speak with them. Sitting with his parents present, he confessed. He said that he and Adamczyk had gone back to the Contreras house after Matt left, that they had intended only to cut the power and frighten Cassie while wearing masks, and that Adamczyk had then begun stabbing her. He minimised his own involvement significantly, placing most of the blame on Adamczyk, but he then led investigators directly to the burial site near Black Rock Canyon. Police dug and found the knives, the gloves, the masks, the clothing, and the video camera with the partially burned tape still inside it. Forensic technicians were able to recover the footage from the damaged tape. What was on it removed any remaining ambiguity. The tape showed the planning sessions in the school library. It showed the boys on the night of the killing, filming themselves outside the Contreras house before going inside. It showed Cassie at her locker that morning. It showed the aftermath. The footage of Draper and Adamczyk in the car before going back to the house, describing their intentions in their own voices and their own words, became one of the most damaging pieces of evidence at trial. Draper is heard on tape saying that unfortunately, they had the grueling task of killing their two friends. Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk were arrested on September 27, 2006, 5 days after Cassie was killed. They were charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Both were 16 years old. Both were tried as adults. Between the arrest and the trial, Cassie's funeral was held on October 1, 2006. 500 people came. The entire community had been shaken by what happened, and the turnout reflected how many people Cassie had touched in her 16 years. Brian Draper attended the funeral. He stood among the people who loved Cassie, among her family, among classmates and neighbours who were devastated by her death. While at the service, he also spoke with police. He told them the same false story about the movie theatre alibi, the same account that had already fallen apart and would lead directly to his confession days later. He was maintaining the lie at his classmate's funeral, surrounded by people who were grieving her, speaking to investigators as though he had nothing to hide. The theatre records showed no tickets had been purchased. The theatre employee who knew the boys confirmed they had not been there. Draper stood at Cassie's funeral and repeated a lie he already knew had no foundation. Draper and Adamczyk were tried separately. Draper's trial was held in 2007 at the Bannock County Courthouse. The prosecution built its case on the buried evidence, the recovered videotape, the failed movie alibi, the forensic evidence linking the serrated knife specifically to Draper, and his own confession to investigators. At trial, each boy largely blamed the other. Adamczyk's defense was that he believed they were making a film and that he had not understood what Draper was actually doing. The video evidence made that position extremely difficult to defend. The tape showed both of them planning, both of them speaking about the killing in their own words, and both of them burying the evidence together afterward. The jury in Draper's trial convicted him of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. He was convicted as an adult. On August 21, 2007, Judge Peter D. McDermott sentenced Brian Draper to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 30 years to life for the conspiracy charge. Adamczyk was convicted and sentenced identically in his own trial. Both boys were 17 at sentencing. In 2011, Draper's attorneys filed an appeal asking the Idaho Supreme Court to vacate his conviction or reduce his sentence to a term that would allow for potential parole after 30 years. The appeal was denied. Adamczyk pursued his own separate appeal in 2010. That was also denied. In 2018, a federal habeas corpus petition was filed on Adamczyk's behalf, challenging the constitutionality of the conviction. The federal court dismissed it. The Stoddart family filed a civil lawsuit in 2010 against the Pocatello School District, arguing that school authorities had been negligent and should have recognized that Draper and Adamczyk posed a risk to others. Both the civil court and the Idaho Supreme Court dismissed the case, finding that the boys' actions could not reasonably have been foreseen by school officials. Cassie's mother Anna continued to speak publicly about her daughter for years. She died in 2022 from cancer. In a 2009 Dateline interview, she said the way Cassie was taken from them just was not fair, and that time had been stolen from her. The community honoured Cassie through a tradition called Pumpkins for Cassie, organised by her grandmother, in which anyone who donated to the Pocatello Animal Shelter or the Idaho Food Bank was given a pumpkin in her memory. As of 2026, Brian Draper is incarcerated at the Idaho State Correctional Institution in Boise. Tori Adamczyk is held at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, also in Boise. The two occasionally see each other in passing, but by all accounts do not communicate. Both were interviewed for a 2026 Hulu docuseries called The Scream Murder, a true teen horror story. The director of that series said both men expressed significant remorse and described them as very different from the teenagers seen on those tapes. She said they understood they could never repair what they had done. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The case that comes next involves another killer who walked into a church and stood among grieving people, but the circumstances were different in one specific way that makes it uniquely disturbing. The man who comes next did not just attend the funeral of the person he had killed. He was asked to be a pallbearer. He carried the casket, he helped lower it into the ground, and the whole time, the woman he was engaged to marry stood right next to him, believing he was there to support her. Case 10. Chris Coleman, Columbia, Illinois, 2009. Christopher Coleman was born and raised in Chester, Illinois, a small Mississippi River town in the southern part of the state. His father, Ron Coleman, was a pastor. Chris grew up in a religious household, attended church, and by all early accounts was the kind of son his community was proud of. He joined the Marines. He was disciplined, physically capable, and presented himself as a man of faith and principle. In May 1997, while attending a K-9 training seminar at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, he met a 21-year-old woman named Sherry Weiss. She was serving in the Air Force. He was 22 and in the Marines. They dated for roughly 3 months. By the end of those 3 months, Sherry was pregnant. The two married and moved forward with building a life together. Their son Garrett was born on April 20th, 1998. Less than 2 years later, Gavin arrived. The family eventually settled in Columbia, Illinois, a quiet suburb south of St. Louis. They bought a 2-story home on Robert Drive in the Columbia Lake subdivision. They joined a non-denominational congregation called Destiny Church, where Sherry threw herself into the community. She organised fundraisers, hosted events, went all out for holidays with the kids, and was described by people who knew her as generous and completely devoted to her family. She had become a stay-at-home mother. Chris Coleman's career had taken a specific and well-compensated turn. Through his military background and connections within Christian ministry circles, he landed a job with Joyce Meyer Ministries, the internationally known evangelical organisation based in the St. Louis suburb of Fenton. Joyce Meyer is one of the most recognised names in Pentecostal Christianity worldwide. Coleman worked his way up within the organisation's security operation and became Joyce Meyer's personal bodyguard and head of security, a role that required constant travel, access to high-level ministry events across the country and internationally, and a 6-figure salary. By all public appearances, Chris Coleman had everything: a beautiful family, a well-paying job, a respected position within a major Christian organisation, and a community that saw him as upstanding. What was happening privately was something entirely different. In November 2008, Chris Coleman began a relationship with a woman named Tara Lintz. Tara was from St. Petersburg, Florida, and had a history with the Coleman family that made the affair particularly personal. She and Sherry had been best friends at Largo High School in Florida. They had grown up together. Sherry Coleman later told friends she occasionally prayed for Tara and hoped she would one day find faith. She had no idea what was happening. Tara Lintz and Coleman met while he was traveling for the ministry. She later testified that their relationship became physical during trips to Hawaii and Arizona. She said Coleman gave her a promise ring. She said they planned to marry in 2010 after he divorced Sherry. She also said he had provided her with a private cell phone that was not accessible to either his wife or his employer, and that they shared credit cards. The relationship was thorough, sustained, and deeply committed on Coleman's end. The only obstacle was that in order to be with Tara, he would have to leave Sherry. And to leave Sherry, he would have to divorce her. And Joyce Meyer Ministries had an organisational policy against divorce. Coleman had been told clearly that his job was dependent on that policy. Joyce Meyer later gave recorded testimony at trial in which she said she did not know about the affair, but indicated that an affair, if discovered, could definitely have affected his position. Coleman was earning a six-figure salary and had built his entire professional identity around this job. He was not willing to lose it. He was not willing to lose Tara either. That left him with what he decided was a third option. Starting in mid-November 2008, threatening emails began arriving at Joyce Meyer Ministries and at the Coleman home. They were sent to Chris Coleman, to Joyce Meyer, and to her son. The emails were menacing in tone, warning that if Meyer did not stop preaching, her security manager's family would be killed. One of the emails said specifically that the sender would kill them all as they sleep. Coleman reported the threats to Columbia Police Sergeant Justin Barlow, who happened to live directly across the street from the Colemans and was a personal acquaintance. Coleman told investigators the threats were connected to his work as Meyer's bodyguard and that someone opposed to the ministry was targeting his family. In February 2009, the threatening messages escalated. Words and phrases were spray-painted in red on the interior walls of the Coleman home. Phrases including, "I am always watching," "You have paid," and "punished" were painted in large letters. Coleman told police a stalker had entered the home and done this. Investigators began working the case as a threat situation, while Coleman cooperated, gave statements, and continued presenting himself as a concerned husband and father whose family was being terrorised. He had painted those walls himself. The spray paint was Rust-Oleum brand. Investigators later found a receipt bearing his name for the purchase of that exact brand. A latex glove found on the side of Interstate 255, near the Jefferson Barracks Bridge, had traces of red spray paint on it. A box of the same type of gloves was found in Coleman's security office at Joyce Meyer Ministries. An Illinois State Police handwriting expert concluded that Coleman probably wrote the messages on the walls. A forensic linguist named Robert Leonard, who had analysed a database of more than 200 emails known to have been written by Coleman, testified that the language patterns in the threatening messages were consistent with Coleman's own writing style, including a specific misspelling that appeared in both his personal emails and in the threat letters. Investigators also established that the threatening emails had been sent from Coleman's own laptop, using his own login credentials, to his own workplace. He had built an elaborate false crime scene, layer by layer, designed to point suspicion at a fictional enemy. He had done all of this while continuing to tell his girlfriend that he was going to give Sherry divorce papers on May 4th or 5th. On the evening of May 4th, 2009, Coleman spoke to Tara Lintz. He told her that he would be serving Sherry with divorce papers the following day. He told her things were moving forward. She later told investigators this was the last conversation they had before the killings. At some point between approximately 11 in the evening on May 4th and 3 in the morning on May 5th, 2009, Christopher Coleman killed his wife and both of his sons. Sherry Coleman, 31, was found strangled in her bed. Garrett, who was 11, was found strangled in his room, curled up in bed. Gavin, who was 9, was found face down, also strangled. All three had ligature marks on their necks, indicating they had been killed with a cord, wire, or rope. The pathologist who conducted the autopsies testified that the time of death was most likely between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., hours before Coleman claimed to have left the house that morning. Coleman's account was that he had woken up around 5:45 in the morning and left for his daily workout at a gym across the state border in Missouri. He said he tried calling Sherry while he was there and got no answer. He then called his neighbour Justin Barlow and asked him to go check on the family because nobody was responding. Barlow crossed the street, found a basement window open, entered the house and made his way through the rooms. He discovered the bodies. A camera that Coleman himself had installed on Barlow's house to monitor his own home recorded no one entering or leaving the Coleman residence between the time Coleman left for the gym and the arrival of police. Police and emergency personnel were at the scene when Coleman pulled into the driveway just before 7 in the morning. An officer immediately kept him outside. Officers later testified that when he was told his family was dead, his first question was not about how they died or who could have done it. He told a police chaplain at the scene that he had an unexplained abrasion on his arm and did not know where it came from. Shortly after making that statement, he punched an ambulance gurney and told his father that was how the abrasion had happened. The major case squad was brought in. The head of that squad, Major Jeff Connor, said in an interview with reporters in the days following the discovery that he believed he knew who had killed Sherry, Gavin, and Garrett. The famed forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden consulted on the case by conference call and concluded that all three victims had almost certainly been killed before Coleman left the house that morning. Investigators had their suspect from nearly the beginning. What they did not yet have was public knowledge of the affair. The Columbia police and investigative reporters began pulling threads simultaneously. Within days of the murders, a reporter revealed that Coleman had been in a relationship with a woman in Florida. The story confirmed what investigators had already established. Coleman resigned from his position at Joyce Meyer Ministries shortly after the affair became public knowledge. While all of this was unfolding, the funeral for Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman was held. It was attended by family, friends, church members, and a community in shock. Christopher Coleman attended. He stood among them. He played the role of a devastated husband and father in front of everyone gathered to grieve the people he had killed. According to search warrants released publicly, on the day of the funeral, Coleman sent text messages to Tara Lintz. Lintz's own phone had already been taken by police as part of their investigation into her as a witness, so Coleman sent the messages to her mother's cell phone, which Lintz was using as a substitute. In those messages, he told Tara Lintz that he missed her and that he loved her. These were the messages he was sending on the day of the funeral. They were documented in court records and became part of the evidence against him. On May 19, 2009, 14 days after the bodies were found, Christopher Coleman was arrested at his parents' home in Chester, Illinois. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was held without bail. The trial began on April 25, 2011, in Waterloo, Illinois, after significant delays and a change of venue from Monroe County to avoid a potentially tainted jury pool. Jurors were selected from Perry County. The prosecution was led by Monroe County State's Attorney Chris Wrights. The defense was handled by attorney Brad Lakin. Coleman did not take the stand. The prosecution's case was built on layers of physical, digital, and forensic evidence. Dr. Michael Baden testified about the time of death, establishing that all 3 victims were killed hours before Coleman claimed to have left the house. A computer forensics analyst testified that the threatening emails had originated from Coleman's laptop. The handwriting expert and forensic linguist both testified linking Coleman's writing patterns to the spray-painted messages and the threat letters. A receipt for the exact brand of spray paint found at the scene bore his name. The box of identical gloves found in his office at Joyce Meyer Ministries matched the glove found on the highway near the bridge with red spray paint on it. Tara Lintz testified, having been ordered by a judge in Florida to travel to St. Louis after initially declining to appear. She wore the promise ring Coleman had given her on the witness stand. She confirmed the affair, confirmed the timeline, and confirmed that Coleman had told her he would be serving Sherry with divorce papers on May 4th or 5th, 2009. She confirmed that he had contacted her after the murders to assure her that he had an alibi and was not responsible. She also confirmed the text messages sent on the day of the funeral. Joyce Meyer gave recorded testimony, which was played for the jury. She did not know about the affair while it was happening, but testified that if she had known, it could definitely have affected his employment. Prosecutors argued that Coleman had understood this, and that facing the choice between his career and his marriage, he had chosen to eliminate his family rather than lose either. The jury of 10 women and 2 men deliberated for approximately 15 hours, spread over 2 days. On May 5, 2011, exactly 2 years to the day after Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman were found dead in their beds, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. Coleman rubbed his face with his hands as the foreman read the verdict. His family left the courtroom immediately and did not take questions. Outside, approximately 150 people who had gathered along the exit route cheered when Coleman was led away in a sheriff's vehicle. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, but Governor Pat Quinn had signed legislation abolishing capital punishment in Illinois in March 2011 and pledged to commute any death sentences imposed before the ban took full effect. The death sentence would have been symbolic. Coleman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In June 2011, a judge denied his request for a retrial. He was transferred that August to Dodge Correctional Institution in Warpen, Wisconsin, for safety reasons. In December 2012, following a legal battle initiated by Sherry's family, the bodies of Sherry, Gavin and Garrett were exhumed from Evergreen Cemetery in Chester, where they had been buried near the plot that would eventually have held Chris Coleman as well, and relocated to Sherry's hometown near Chicago. A judge ruled that a convicted murderer should not have control over the remains of his victims. In January 2015, an appeals court upheld Coleman's life sentence, finding that the circumstantial evidence presented at trial had been overwhelming. As of 2018, Coleman maintained his innocence in an interview with Crime Watch Daily, claiming he had been set up. He remains in prison. Sherry Coleman was 31, Garrett was 11, Gavin was 9. And with that, every case on this list has been laid out. 10 killers, 10 funerals. 10 moments where someone chose to stand among the people they had destroyed and keep performing. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.